My name is Ellen, and I'm 36 years old. I'd like to tell you about something that happened with my nephew, Igor. It started one spring evening. My husband, Jose, had gone to work early to complete a job at the building site with some customers. For the last 3 months, his workdays had been very busy and long, which had become normal. This often left me by myself for many days and meant we didn't get to spend much time together. On this particular evening, I was very tired and feeling lonely, so I went to bed early. I enjoyed the quiet of the empty house. The calmness made me feel peaceful. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but when I slowly opened my eyes, I saw my nephew, Igor. He was standing there with a notebook, looking worried, like he didn't want to disturb me. "Sorry for waking you, Annalene," he said, "but I need this notebook for schoolwork, and I couldn't find it anywhere." Igor was always well-mannered and thoughtful, so I was surprised to see him in my bedroom so late. I sat up, fixed my sleepwear, and smiled at him. "It's okay, Igor. Don't worry," I said. "Why don't you sit down for a little while?" I pointed to a chair next to my bed. He paused for a second, but then sat down. We talked about his studies and how hard his final year of college was. As we chatted, I realized how much he had grown up. He wasn't the little kid I remembered, but a smart and kind young man. I'd always liked those qualities about him. "Thank you for listening," he said. Annaline confessed, a little bashful, that it can be tough to find a good listener. I told him I'd always be there for him. That moment made me realize how much I valued this true friendship, something I'd been missing. That night, my loneliness faded thanks to this special connection. I understood how much our friendship meant to me, stirring up strong feelings I couldn't deny. It felt like the start of something new and surprising. In the following days, Igor and I chatted more frequently. He became a regular part of my life, filling the void left by Josie's long workdays. Our talks were a welcome break in my daily routine. My friendship with Igor became a source of comfort and encouragement in my solitude. We often talked in the kitchen, or sometimes in my room, about all sorts of things. One evening, after one of these chats, things changed. We were discussing his schoolwork and goals when he asked if I'd ever considered my own dreams. His question surprised me. No one had asked me that in ages. I answered truthfully, talking about my forgotten hopes and how my life with Josie, although comfortable, sometimes felt restricting, especially because of the time he spent on his work, which seemed to be driving us apart. Igor listened with kindness and understanding. "It must be difficult, Aunt," he said. "I've always thought of you as a resilient person, but everyone needs support sometimes." His words touched me deeply. I had gotten used to being the pillar that kept everything in order, but I had forgotten how much I needed emotional support myself. With his youth and empathy, Igor offered me an unexpected comfort. As the night went on, the connection between us flowed naturally. We laughed, shared secrets, and created a bond deeper than I could have imagined. At one point, I realized something had shifted. I noticed the way Igor looked at me, the warmth in his smile, and the depth in his eyes. I tried to attribute these feelings to the loneliness and vulnerability of the moment. But it was hard to ignore. There was something in his closeness that stirred long, forgotten sensations within me. He broke my thoughts by suggesting I get some rest, and before leaving, he assured me he would always be there if I needed him. That night, a mixture of conflicting emotions filled me when I was alone. I realized I was thinking about him more than I should in the following weeks. Igor became a frequent presence, especially on the nights Jose worked late-hour meetings, initially marked by light conversations. And moral support began to take on a different depth over time. On one particular afternoon, after opening up about the growing distance between Jose and me, I messaged Igor, and he soon showed up, sitting in the garden. We talked about various things to ease my mind, but something felt different that various things to ease. Evening. Igor's gaze was intense, in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't the look of a nephew, but of a man, and it awakened a liveliness in me that I hadn't felt in a long time. I tried to justify what I was feeling as just a reflection of my loneliness. But the more I reflected, the more I realized there was something simmering between us at one point, as he reached for a notebook that had fallen our hands, briefly touched, but it was enough to ignite a spark. Our eyes met, and in that instant, I knew he had felt it too. He asked if everything was okay, his voice filled with concern and something deeper. I nodded, surprised by the intensity of the moment. We sat in silence until he broke the spell, whispering that this wasn't right. I took a deep breath and pulled my hand back, but I knew these feelings wouldn't disappear so easily. The first real connection between Igor and me happened one night when the tension between us was at its peak. We were talking as usual, but there was something different in the air. The conversation took on a more personal and intimate tone, and I felt that we were crossing an invisible line. At one point, Igor leaned over to pick up a notebook he had dropped, and his hand touched mine. This time, it wasn't just an accidental touch. His fingers intertwined with mine, sending a shiver down my spine. When our eyes met, I realized he felt the same desire burning within me. I'm not sure what's happening, but I can't ignore it. I whispered, my heart pounding as I searched for words. I don't know either, Alan, he replied, but maybe we can face this together. With a gentle look and soft voice, Igor wrapped me in a hug. It was a gesture full of warmth and affection, and I held on to him close to mine, aware that there was no going back. The desire I had repressed for so long finally surfaced when our lips met. Started out tentative, but quickly turned intense, and all concerns about morality and consequences faded away. After that first, we fell silent for a moment, both breathing heavily, overcome by the emotions that had been released. Igor, this is crazy, I whispered, still feeling the urgency of the contact. I know, Elaine, but I can't help it. I need to be close to you, he replied with disarming sincerity. Without further words, I let myself be swept away by the moment, embracing him again. Our kid growing more intense and passionate. The room seemed to be filled with a palpable energy, and before we knew it, we were in bed, our bodies entwined in a dance of passion and surrender. The intimacy shared that night went beyond the physical, creating a deep connection, as if our souls were finally understood and accepted. That night, as we finally drifted to sleep, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. However, deep down, I knew this stolen happiness came with a price. In the weeks that followed, we lived a whirlwind of emotions and clandestine encounters, doing our best to leave no trace, which only added an aura of adrenaline and forbidden passion. Each new meeting mixed love with the constant anxiety of being discovered. Yet we continued night after night. One evening, as we together discussing the meaning of it all, for us a tension of worry and emotion filled the air. Elaine, I don't know how much longer we can keep this up. Igor said, his voice heavy with unease. We need to be careful. I suggest we find a way to be together without risking everything. He looked at me with a seriousness he rarely showed, and a spark of hope appeared in his eyes. We agreed to keep our relationship discreet and took all the necessary precautions to avoid being discovered. But the intensity of our feelings only grew. Each encounter became a mix of fleeting love and the fear of the forbidden. With a voice marked by concern, I said that I could no longer be without him, and that it was too late to turn back. Breaking the silence Daniel suggested that we could keep seeing each other in secret, but with extreme caution. We can't afford to make mistakes, he said with determination. I nodded, realizing that this was our only option for the time being. Thus, we sealed our pact, deciding to keep our relationship hidden, fully aware of the risks, but determined to face them for the love that bound us together one night. As we were together in my room, we heard a noise coming from the living room. In a moment of panic, I pulled Iger into the closet. He was pale and trembling, and a wave of guilt washed over me. "This is too risky," I whispered. He agreed, his voice trembling, and said we needed to be more careful. I nodded, admitting he was right. We had been lucky that time, but we couldn't rely on it forever. We needed to be smarter and more discreet. Still, I noticed in his eyes that he wasn't entirely convinced that suspicions had been cleared. I knew it would be hard to fully escape them 2 weeks after that incident. Igor was focused on his final exams in his last year of college. Meanwhile, I began feeling unwell, plagued by nausea for several weeks deep down. I knew something was wrong, and the emotional toll of what was happening weighed heavily on me. Tried to ignore it, and not dwell too much on it. One day, when Josie returned from completing a project he had been working on, he suggested we take a trip to celebrate. I agreed, but mentioned that I was feeling a bit sick and needed to go to the hospital. Worried, Josie called a doctor to come to our house hours later. After the tests, the doctor confirmed with a smile that I was 2 months pregnant. Josie was surprised and confused, questioning how this could have happened, since it had been a while since we'd been intimate. I agreed to go on the trip, and once we returned home, I prepared myself to explain the situation. After listening to the entire story, Jose stood up, packed his bags, and cut off contact with me. I was devastated, consumed by the guilt that seemed to suffocate me. At the same time, I realized my feelings for Igor had deepened even further. Between passion and the mistakes I had made, I didn't have the courage to tell Igor what had happened, hoping he could finish his internship at the university in peace. Now, I find myself at a crossroads, overcome with intense